In the rolling hills of Mercer County, where fog clings low to the earth like a buried memory, sits the forgotten skeleton of a place called Calvin's Hollow. A church, a barn, a few stone foundations, that's all that remains. But for nearly 3 decades, this was home to one of Kentucky's most secretive religious communities. On paper, they were simple people of faith. In reality, they were something else entirely. Between 1811 and 1838, 322 members vanished without a trace. Not one missing person report, not one public inquiry, only silence. And for years, the state of Kentucky sealed every record related to the Hollow under religious protection clauses. But then came a torn journal, found hidden inside a wall by a demolition crew in 2023. A journal that belonged to a young woman named Lydia Ann Price, the last person ever baptized into the Hollow community. Her words didn't just describe what she saw, they documented how it happened, how the community changed, how people stopped speaking at dinner, how one by one families disappeared overnight, and how she discovered what was buried beneath the church cellar. This isn't a legend, it's a pattern, a calculated system that erased hundreds of people over 27 years, not through violence, but through something far more permanent: devotion. Before we go further, I need you to understand, this video isn't for entertainment. It's for those who feel something's always been hidden behind faith, power, and history. If you're still here, comment the word "She is waiting" below. Do it twice, once for you and once for the ones who never got out. Let the algorithm know you're ready to know. Now let's step back to where it all began, 1811. The year Reverend Elijah Price left Lexington with his wife, 2 sons, and a doctrine he claimed had been delivered by angels in smoke. What he built wasn't a church, it was a vault for souls. And it worked, because for 27 years, no one came out. The year was 1811 and Kentucky was still rough country, thick forests, scattered settlements, and a population eager for spiritual revival. It was during this chaos that Reverend Elijah Price arrived with his family and a small group of followers. They purchased 300 acres of untouched woodland outside Harrodsburg and named it Calvin's Hollow, after an obscure 16th-century Protestant martyr no one had ever heard of. At first, the Price family kept a low profile. They built a simple chapel, cleared farmland, and invited only a few trusted families to join. But word spread quickly, not from advertisements or sermons, but from testimonies whispered at river docks and county fairs. People said Reverend Price could heal the sick just by reading from a burnt Bible, that his daughter Miriam could speak languages she never studied, that the soil inside the hollow grew corn in half the time. Within 5 years, the community had swelled to over 150 members, all of whom surrendered their land deeds and belongings to the church. No outsiders allowed in, no letters allowed out. The state called them reclusive. Locals called them the grey folk. Every man wore the same ash-coloured coat, every woman a smoke-coloured bonnet, and every child, from the age of 3, stopped speaking in public. Reverend Price called it spiritual silence. But those who once visited the hollow before it closed its gates forever in 1818 described it differently. One merchant named Jonas Kettler, who delivered salted meat to the community for 3 winters, left behind an affidavit before he died. In it he wrote, "They never blinked, never looked you in the eye. And every time I unloaded my cart, a tall man with dark gloves stood in the shadow of the bell tower, just watching." By 1820, Calvin's Hollow stopped accepting deliveries. They were self-sufficient. They said God had given them a new crop, a vine that grew underground, required no sunlight, and fed the entire community. No one believed them, but no one ever went in to check. Until 1822, when a sheriff's deputy from Mercer County went missing after serving a simple tax inquiry. His name was Thomas Bell, 25 years old, newly married. He was last seen walking into the hollow gates. The Prices claimed he'd turned to God and joined them. His wife received a note, 3 lines in perfect cursive, allegedly in Thomas's handwriting. "I've found peace. Do not look for me. God is the only witness now." But something was wrong. Thomas Bell was illiterate. After Deputy Thomas Bell disappeared, the town changed. His wife, Eleanor Bell, refused to accept the letter as truth. She knew her husband. He couldn't even write his own name without trembling. The handwriting on the note wasn't his, and the calm, rehearsed tone didn't sound like a man who had just abandoned his entire life. It sounded like a script. Eleanor took her concerns to the Mercer County Sheriff, but her pleas were dismissed as hysteria. She was told Calvin's Hollow was a recognized religious order with legal protection. The Prices were peculiar, they admitted, but not criminal. Eleanor didn't stop. She visited neighbors who had family inside the hollow, hoping someone had seen her husband. What she discovered instead was that at least 6 others had vanished that year, and no one had ever filed a report. Farmers, widows, even a young midwife, all said to have converted and joined the community. But none were ever seen again. No visitors, no letters, no burials. And then the dreams began. It started with Eleanor. She said she would wake in the middle of the night, frozen, unable to speak, staring at a corner of her bedroom where a woman stood, grey bonnet, pale skin, mouth moving, but no sound. Every night, the same figure, always closer. 2 months later, the blacksmith's son, Caleb White, described the same vision, then the preacher's wife, then a schoolteacher. Each claimed the woman whispered names in silence, the same names they saw on the missing persons board, the ones the sheriff kept removing. When Reverend Elijah Price was confronted by a group of townsmen in April 1823, he stood calmly at the hollow gate, hands folded, and said, "There is no death here, only submission." He offered to let one man enter and see the community for himself. Under one condition, no weapons, no questions, and he must leave by sundown. Samuel Glenn, a war veteran and Mason, agreed. He entered the hollow around 9 a.m. He did not return by nightfall. When the group approached the gates the next morning, the Prices handed them a sack containing Samuel's boots, belt buckle, and his Masonic ring, all perfectly cleaned and wrapped in linen. There was no blood, no body, just a single note pinned to his coat. The body must fall, for the soul to rise. By late 1823, fear had turned into paralysis. Locals whispered about Calvin's Hollow, but no one dared to act. The Price family had made themselves untouchable, not through violence, but through ambiguity. They gave no reason to prosecute, no bodies to bury, and no statements to dispute. Even state officials treaded carefully, fearing religious retaliation or, worse, accusations of suppressing faith. But in private, rumors spread like mold. It was said that Reverend Elijah Price no longer aged, that his beard, once streaked with white, had turned coal black again, that he spoke in tongues known only to the dead, and that when the full moon rose, no smoke ever left the hollow's chimneys, not a single one. And then came Lydia Ann Price. Born inside the hollow in 1816, she was the first child to be baptized under Elijah's new doctrine, a rewritten theology he called the path of diminishing flesh. It taught that the soul was burdened by memory, identity, and personal will, that salvation required not belief, but erasure. By age 10, Lydia had already stopped using personal pronouns. At 12, she no longer slept in a bed, claiming horizontal rest is for those who wish to dream. And by 14, she was appointed the record keeper, a role that involved transcribing all sermons, documenting conversions, and updating the community's soul ledger. That ledger, bound in lambskin and inked in red, listed every member's birth name, assigned number, assigned task, and stage of shedding. Once a member reached stage 5, the record stopped. No date, no note, just a clean black line across the entry. Outsiders never saw the ledger. But Lydia's private journal, found 201 years later behind a brick in the church wall, revealed that stage 5 wasn't a spiritual milestone, it was an end point. In one chilling entry, dated November 4, 1832, she wrote, Brother Amos reached 5 this morning. He did not scream. That is good. The water was still. No thrashing. I held the cloth for only 37 seconds. Another line followed in smaller, shakier script. I must forget him now. Elijah says the soul cannot rise while memory holds it down. That was the first time Lydia used a name in reference to the ritual. It would not be the last. By 1833, Calvin's Hollow was nearly inaccessible, not just by geography, but by psychology. The Price family had transformed their doctrine into a closed-loop system. Every question led back to obedience. Every doubt was reframed as spiritual immaturity. New converts, often the desperate and grieving, were welcomed with warmth and quiet ceremony. They were bathed in silence, stripped of outside belongings, assigned new names, numbers, and labor roles. Within weeks, their memories were no longer their own. This wasn't religion. It was behavioral reprogramming. The Hollow Choir, once a literal group of singers, had become the name for a subterranean structure beneath the chapel, a network of chambers where retreats were held. Outsiders never saw these rooms. Even most members didn't know they existed, but Lydia did. Her journal described the choir as rooms without windows, built for silence. Each chamber contained a cot, a basin, a Bible with missing pages, and one unlit lantern. The walls were etched with scriptures, but rewritten in subtle ways. He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it, became, he that forgetteth himself entirely shall become one with the flame. She described Brother Hiram, a convert from Ohio, who asked if he could write to his sister before entering retreat. The next morning his bed was empty, his name was crossed from the ledger. She remembered the smell of cedarwood always burning near the Hollow Choir. To disguise the other smell, she wrote, though she never named it. But cracks were forming, not in the stone walls, but in Lydia's thoughts. Her journal entries became less obedient, more questioning. She wrote of dreams she couldn't explain, a face she kept seeing, not in reality, but in reflections. A woman wrapped in grey, mouth stitched shut, eyes wide and full of water. And then one day, a new arrival changed everything. His name was Michael Dunbar, a war orphan from Tennessee, just 17. He wasn't like the others. He didn't accept the silence. He asked questions. He smiled too long. And worst of all, he remembered things, names, faces, cities. Lydia was assigned to guide him. What began as correction turned into conversation, and what began as conversation became conspiracy. I began to trade memories in secret, speak in riddles to avoid detection, tap coded messages under the dining tables, Lydia wrote. Michael says memory is a rebellion, that if I remember who I was, they cannot erase what I am. But in Calvin's Hollow, memory came with a cost. Michael Dunbar was the spark they couldn't control. Within weeks of his arrival, something shifted inside Lydia, something the Prices had spent years suppressing. She began to recall her mother's voice, long thought lost. She remembered songs that weren't in the community hymnal. And worst of all, she began to doubt Elijah. Michael didn't just question. He observed. He noticed how no two people in the Hollow ever worked the same task for more than 7 days, a tactic, he believed, to prevent bonding. He noticed that everyone who reached stage 4 was reassigned to remote field duties, closer to the woods and far from others. And he noticed the black-robed watchers who never participated in worship, only stood at the edge, hands folded, eyes closed, lips moving silently. They weren't praying. They were counting. One night in July, Lydia and Michael met beneath the orchard sheds, a place rarely monitored. Michael showed her something dangerous, something that should have been burned the moment it entered the Hollow, a letter from the outside. It was written by Thomas Bell's brother, still searching after 10 years. The letter had been intercepted and stashed by a convert named Ruth, who died mysteriously 2 weeks after its arrival. In the letter, Thomas's brother described matching cases across the state, Missing persons who had last been seen attending revival meetings or buying farm goods from Hollow members at market stalls. Michael believed the Hollow wasn't isolated by accident. It was a hub, a spoke in a much larger wheel. And the prices? They weren't just a family. They were a gatekeeping mechanism, chosen, perhaps even instructed, to keep something buried and breathing beneath that soil. Lydia began stealing, moments from her duties to search, logs, records, maps. In a drawer beneath the record room's altar, she found a rusted iron key tied with grey cloth. She didn't know what it opened until August 12, 1833. That was the night Brother Caleb Price was found dead, face down in the creek, eyes missing, mouth packed with soil. No investigation, no mourning, only a sermon the next morning from Elijah. Even the pure can stumble, but the Hollow forgives, and so it swallows. That day, Lydia was called into Elijah's private chamber. Waiting for her on the desk was her journal. Elijah Price didn't speak for a long time. He sat behind his worn cedar desk, fingers steepled, Lydia's journal laid open before him. The pages had been marked with ash, not ink, a ritual used in the Hollow only when preparing something for burning. He looked up slowly, his eyes dull grey like smoke trapped in glass. Behind him the curtains were drawn, though it was midday, and the room, always silent, was now filled with a low, pulsing hum. "You've remembered too much," he said. Lydia didn't answer. Her hands trembled behind her apron. She wanted to scream, but she knew. In the Hollow, sound could betray you. Elijah lifted a page from the journal, the one where she described Michael's theory about the Watchers counting, about memory being rebellion. He didn't seem angry, just disappointed. "You were to become the next mother," he said quietly, "the she-binder, the one who seals the forgetting." Lydia's breath caught. The term she-binder was never spoken aloud. It only appeared once, carved into the back wall of the Hollow choir's inner sanctum. A term older than Calvin's Hollow itself, older even than the Prices. Then Elijah slid something across the table, the iron key she had taken. This unlocked what should have stayed buried. He motioned for the Watchers. 2 men in grey robes appeared, at the door behind her. Their faces were completely shaven, eyebrows removed, mouths sewn shut with black twine. One held a silver bowl, the other a knife. "You will drink," Elijah whispered, "and forget, or you will descend." The bowl was filled with something thick and pale, not water, not wine. It smelled like damp clay and copper. Lydia felt the Watchers moving closer. The knife gleamed in candlelight. But then, a sound. Tapping from below. 3 knocks, then 2, then 3 again. It was Michael's code. He had reached the lower levels. He had found the Hollow choir. Lydia snapped. She flipped the bowl, shattering it on the floor. In the chaos, she grabbed the candle and thrust it toward the Watchers, blinding one. Screams erupted. Not from her, not from Elijah, but from beneath the floorboards. Muffled, dozens of them, men, women, children. She ran. Through the curtain, down the hall, past the bell tower, toward the orchard. She didn't stop until she found Michael, covered in dirt, holding something in his hands, a journal, bound in black. Not hers, someone else's. The journal Michael held was cold to the touch. Its cover was stitched from black calfskin, worn at the corners and sealed with a wax emblem Lydia had never seen before. A tree with no leaves, its roots twisted into a circle. Inside, the pages weren't written with ink. They were etched, deep grooves pressed into the parchment, as if carved by someone who no longer trusted pens. Michael's voice shook as he handed it to her. "It's not just this place," he said. "It's everywhere." They flipped through the pages in silence beneath the orchard. concealed by moonlight and moss. The journal contained names, dates, and locations, dozens of them. Communities like Calvin's Hollow, some in Appalachia, others across Missouri, West Virginia, even Canada. All religious, all closed to the outside. And in each, a pattern. A founding family, a strict doctrine, staged disappearances, and then obliteration. Each site bore the same final line. It was swallowed, as planned. Lydia found entries written by someone signed only as M.E. The handwriting was rigid, almost mechanical. One passage read, "The doctrine of diminishing flesh is not isolated. It is a vessel. We are not bound by scripture, but by ritual. The first shedding always begins with silence, the second with water, the third with memory." Another page was more direct. "The woman in grey is real. She is the consequence of remembering." Lydia dropped the journal. Michael stared ahead, eyes wide. "She's not a ghost," he said. "She's a signal." The moment he said it, the bells rang. Not the chapel bell, but the underground one. The one they were never supposed to hear. A deep, metallic groan that sounded like stone being pulled across stone. It meant discovery. The orchard lit up. Torches in the distance. Dozens, maybe more. The watchers were coming. Lydia grabbed the black journal and led Michael toward the old mill path, the one the elders claimed had been closed by a landslide decades ago. But she knew that was a lie. She'd read the original settlement maps. The path led beyond the hollow's perimeter. They ran. Branches cut their skin. Roots grabbed their ankles. The air turned thick, humming with that same low vibration she'd heard in Elijah's study. The ground pulsed like it was breathing. And then came the scream. Not human, not animal, not of this world. Michael stopped. "She knows," he whispered. "We broke the pattern." They didn't stop running. The scream that echoed behind them, if it could even be called that, didn't chase them through the trees. It coated the air as if the sound itself had weight, like smoke trying to force its way into their lungs. The forest didn't sway. The wind didn't move. It was as if time had folded in on itself. But Lydia and Michael knew one thing. The hollow would never let them leave alive. As they reached the old mill path, they found the stone gate, half buried in moss and thyme. It was still sealed, but Lydia had the iron key, the same one she'd taken from the record room. She shoved it into the rusted lock. It didn't fit at first. Then it clicked. The gate groaned open, revealing a narrow corridor of carved stone, older than anything in the hollow. It smelled of salt and sulfur. The markings on the walls weren't in English, or any known language. Spirals, intersecting eyes, inverted trees. Michael stared too long and began to tremble. "This tunnel isn't for escape," he muttered. "It was built for return." They pressed forward anyway. Behind them, the bell rang again. Twice this time. A signal they didn't understand, but someone did. As they emerged into a clearing far beyond the hollow, they saw it. A wide field of standing stones arranged in concentric circles, each stone carved with a name. Some they recognized from the ledger, most they didn't. And in the center, an altar, blackened from fire, wrapped in rotting cloth and bearing a symbol Lydia had seen only once before. A woman's face, mouth sewn shut, eyes open, and beneath it, "She binds what you remember." Michael fell to his knees. He began coughing violently. Blood stained his hands. Lydia tried to lift him, but his body went limp. She looked up, and there she was. The woman in grey. No longer in a dream, no longer in reflections. Real, and watching. She stood silently between the stones, her robes dragging across the earth, her face obscured, but not hidden. Her eyes were not eyes. They were holes, depthless, pulling in thought, memory, identity. Lydia screamed, but it made no sound. The woman raised her hand, and for a moment, Lydia felt her mind unravel, not in pain but in surrender, as if letting go of herself was mercy. And then Michael spoke. No. One word. It broke the silence. The woman froze. The field trembled. And Lydia ran. Lydia didn't look back. She ran until her feet bled, until the standing stones disappeared behind the trees, and until the forest grew silent again, not the silence of peace, but the kind that presses against your skull, the kind that waits. When she finally collapsed, gasping for breath, Michael wasn't behind her. She was alone. The stars had shifted, the moon hung low and red. Something had changed. She couldn't say how long she'd been running. An hour? A day? The woods were unfamiliar now. Trees grew in spirals. The moss pulsed faintly under her fingertips. Her own breath sounded wrong, echoing. Lydia opened the black journal again. It had changed. New pages had appeared, handwritten, not etched. And the handwriting was hers. She hadn't written them. One entry read, "Flight is not escape. Return is the right. Memory is the sin. Michael was the cost. I am the witness." Another page described the altar in precise detail. Symbols she hadn't fully seen, phrases she hadn't read. One line was underlined 3 times. The gate does not close until the binder chooses silence. Lydia's hands began to shake. She heard something behind her. Not footsteps. Breathing. Shallow. Ragged. Wet. She turned slowly. But there was nothing. The trees were still. The air was heavy. And then a soft sound, like pages turning. She looked down. The journal was open to a final page. Still warm. The ink freshly dried. It bore one sentence. "You are remembering too clearly." And underneath, scratched deeply into the parchment, Stage 5. Her blood ran cold. Stage 5 was the final entry in the hollow soul ledger, the moment when a person became ready to be unmade. She thought she had escaped the system. But the truth was far worse. The hollow had left with her. Lydia looked around. The trees began to twist, forming a pulled chess. The moon vanished behind clouds that had no sky. Whispers began, not from one direction but all around her. Voices she knew. Michael, her mother, brother Hiram, even Eleanor Bell, all repeating the same word. Shed, over and over, and then a familiar voice. Drink, Elijah's voice. Right behind her. Lydia turned slowly, heart pounding, hands still clutching the journal. There was no one there, but his voice had been clear, as if Elijah was standing behind her, breathing. And then, from the trees, footsteps, not one set, many. She backed away, stumbling over roots that hadn't been there moments before. The forest was shifting, subtly, deliberately, like it was closing in around her. The trees formed not walls but aisles like pews, and down the center, walking in absolute silence, came the watchers. 10 of them, maybe 12. Their robes now darker than before, nearly black, faces still smooth and pale, mouths still stitched shut. But something was different. Their eyes. They didn't have any. Just dark, empty sockets. At the head of the procession was a child, maybe 6 years old, walking barefoot, dragging a grey cloth behind her. She looked straight at Lydia and smiled. Then she spoke, though her lips never moved. The hollow does not need walls. It lives in the places you forget, and it remembers for you. Lydia's knees buckled. She dropped the journal. The child reached down, picked it up without looking and handed it to one of the watchers. Then she whispered something that stopped Lydia's breath. Stage 6 begins now. There had never been a stage 6. Not in the ledger, not in the doctrine. But it explained everything. Lydia hadn't escaped. She'd advanced, past memory, past rebellion. She had become something the doctrine never intended, an anomaly, a soul who saw through the ritual and kept her mind intact. The forest lit with faint white flame, tracing the air like ink across parchment. Every root, every leaf, every stone inscribed with writing she could now read. It wasn't scripture, it was instruction. It told her how to build. It told her how to erase. It told her how to replace Elijah. And in that moment, Lydia understood the final truth of the hollow. It never needed Elijah. It needed a vessel. Someone who remembered exactly enough to begin the cycle again. The watchers knelt. The child extended her hand, and Lydia took it. The last page of the black journal wrote itself as her fingers made contact. The binder has chosen. The ritual began before she understood it. The child led Lydia down a corridor of kneeling watchers. None moved. None blinked. They bowed their heads as if in reverence. But Lydia knew, deep in her bones, that it wasn't her they were worshipping. It was what she was becoming. The forest opened into a clearing Lydia had never seen, yet somehow recognized. Stone monoliths arranged in a spiral, each one carved with a name, each name struck through with a vertical line, hundreds of them. And in the center stood a stone basin filled with a dark liquid that reflected no light. Beside it, a single tool, a long bone-handled stylus, its tip blackened from use. This was the place the ledgers had hinted at, not heaven, not hell, but the registry. The child pointed to the basin. "Write the name," she said, "to seal the forgetting." Lydia shook her head. Whose name? But she already knew the answer. Michael. The air thickened. The watchers stood in unison, heads snapping upward in unison like puppets pulled by a single wire. Their mouths, still stitched, began humming, low, deep, the same frequency she had felt in Elijah's chamber, the same sound she had felt in her chest, in her dreams, in her blood. The basin rippled. Lydia stepped forward. Her hand moved toward the stylus as if guided by something outside of her. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it, stared into the basin, and watched as her reflection disappeared, replaced by Michael's face. Not dead, not alive, suspended. His eyes blinked once, then locked onto hers. No fear, just understanding. And then, acceptance. Lydia began to write. Letter by letter, the stylus etched Michael Dunbar into the surface of the basin, but the grooves closed the moment she finished. The name had been taken. Bound. The child spoke again. Now drink. The watchers parted. Lydia stood alone before the basin. She leaned in. The liquid smelled of ash and something older, something like time rot. She cupped her hands and drank. Cold, thick, weightless. And then it began. Memories flooded her, but not hers. Hundreds. People who had vanished. Their final thoughts. Their last hopes. The betrayal. The prayers. The silence. She felt herself dissolving, but not dying. Becoming. A new page in the black journal turned itself. Blank. Waiting. Lydia's hand began to move, without thought, without will, and she began to write. I am the binder, and this is how the next hollow begins. When Lydia woke, the forest was gone. She lay in the center of an empty field, surrounded by stone ruins and broken pews, beneath a grey sky that didn't move. No sun, No clouds, just endless, lightless haze. The black journal was beside her. Its cover now bore a new symbol, an open eye with 3 vertical lines across the iris. She opened it. The first page was no longer written in her hand. It was in Elijah's. "You did well, daughter. You were the only one who remembered deeply enough to become. The others fled, fought, died. You understood." The next line chilled her blood. "I was the binder before you, and before me, Miriam, and before her, Esther of the Pines. You didn't destroy the hollow. You joined the lineage." Lydia stood slowly, clutching the journal to her chest. The stone altar where she had written Michael's name now stood cracked, but not destroyed. Something pulsed beneath it, alive, waiting. The watchers had vanished. The child was gone, but the silence remained, dense, humming, watchful. She wandered through the field. The monoliths had shifted again. The names etched in them were no longer ones she recognized. These were new names, names she hadn't yet met. Eleanor Bell, Caleb White, Samuel Glenn. You, her own name, stood at the center, not struck through, not yet. Lydia turned to the east. A long dirt road had formed, lined with burned trees, and in the distance beyond the mist, a chapel. Rebuilt, pristine, empty. She walked. Every step drew the world into sharper focus. Not the old world, a mirror of it, a reflection carefully crafted, ready to accept new converts, new memory, new forgetting. When she reached the chapel, the door creaked open at her touch. Inside, everything had been prepared. The ledger, the stylus, the robes, the communion table. But most importantly, the journal's final blank page. She sat. She wrote a single line. "The hollow does not take. It teaches you to give willingly." And with that, she lit the altar flame. Somewhere beyond time, the bells began to ring again. 3 times. And in towns miles away, in Harrodsburg, in Lexington, in quiet corners of Tennessee, people would wake from their sleep, gasping for air, unsure why they dreamed of a woman in grey, asking them to return. The hollow had begun again, but this time under a new name. The new name came to Lydia not in a dream but in a whisper, one that echoed through the chapel walls as if the stones themselves remembered it. The House of Stillness. It was perfect. Not too bold, not too obscure, just enough to draw the lonely, the grieving, the ones who needed to forget. She etched it into the entrance stone above the chapel doors, just beneath the binding mark, the open eye with 3 vertical lines. The name would be spoken softly in the years to come, passed from one wanderer to another like an invitation wrapped in peace. But peace was never the promise. It was only the bait. Lydia began the work in silence. The fields were replanted with the hollow's buried vine, the one that grew in darkness. The orchard reappeared, but now the fruit bore no seeds. The watchers returned in pairs, each carrying a silver bowl and a mirror, their eyes still gone, their mouths now completely sealed with skin. And in the stillest hours of night, the child returned. But she had grown. No longer 6. Now perhaps 12. She didn't speak in riddles. She didn't need to. She only asked one question each time she appeared. "Are you ready to forget again?" And each time Lydia answered, "No, not yet." Because she wasn't like Elijah, or Miriam, or Esther. Lydia had not surrendered. She remembered every face, every name, every hand that reached out before being erased. And she was writing it all down. In a second journal hidden beneath the chapel floor, bound not in skin, but in linen. A book not of ritual, but of truth. A record for the one who would come after her, the next anomaly. Because Lydia had discovered something none of the others ever had, the hollow couldn't bind her if she bound herself first. She would play the role. She would say the words. She would mark the ledgers, drink the ash, sing the hymns in the language of forgetting. But in secret, she would remember everything. And one day, when the right soul arrived, someone like Michael, she would give them the second journal. She would send them through the old mill path. She would show them the altar, the names, the cost. And she would whisper, "End it, if you can." Because not all binders are loyal. Some are waiting. Years passed. From the outside, the House of Stillness appeared serene, a beacon for the weary, a sanctuary for the broken. The county clerk in Harrodsburg signed off on its paperwork in 1841, calling it a well-managed faith collective with exceptional agricultural discipline. Donations flowed in, visitors arrived in small numbers, never all at once, never more than needed. They were always chosen: widows, veterans, orphans, runaways, those who would not be missed, those with gaps in their past, the ones already hollowing from within. They were welcomed with warmth, fed, dressed in grey, invited to prayer. And within 7 days, the forgetting began. Stage 1, abandon names. Stage 2, relinquish possessions. Stage 3, silence. Stage 4, surrender to the watchers. Stage 5, acceptance. Stage 6, reserved only for the binder to decide. But something else began happening during these years. Not all who entered were forgetting. Some remembered things that weren't theirs, visions of ancient rituals, glimpses of Lydia's journal pages, dreams of the monoliths before they arrived. They spoke of the eye before seeing it. They repeated phrases no one had taught them. The vine feeds the root feeds the eye. She is not death, she is the ledger. One convert, a woman named Clara Hughes, came forward during morning confession and said she had seen Michael in her sleep. Not his face, but his scream, and the sound of stone bells under water. The watchers took her away. Lydia didn't stop them. But that night, she added Clara's name to the linen journal, and next to it, she wrote one word in red ink: catching. It was a term Lydia invented for what she feared most: spiritual contagion. The anomaly she once was might be spreading. And with each new convert who came too aware too quickly, Lydia began to feel the hollow's grip weaken. The rituals still worked, the forgetting still happened, but not as cleanly. More dreams, more resistance, more remembering. And then came the letter. Unmarked, slipped beneath the chapel door. No signature, just 7 words, handwritten in the same mechanical script as the Bian. Lack journal. We are watching the binder this time. Lydia didn't sleep for 3 nights, because she knew Elijah was gone, but they weren't. Lydia read the letter 100 times. Each time the words seemed to tighten, as if the ink itself grew heavier, darker. We are watching the binder this time. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder, a declaration that she had never been truly alone. She tried burning the letter, but the flames recoiled. The parchment refused to curl. The words refused to die. She buried it instead, deep beneath the orchard roots. And still, she dreamed of it every night. In those dreams, she saw herself walking backward through the hollow, faces blurred, voices muffled, the chapel now a skeleton, and at the center of it all, the altar cracked open with a staircase descending into something not built by hands. She began to suspect that the hollow was never created by the Price family, not really, that they too had only inherited it, that each binder merely added a new chapter, to a book that was never meant to end. And now, Lydia had become a page-turner. But even as fear clawed at her mind, she continued the work. She still performed the ceremonies, still guided the converts, still etched names into the ledger. But more and more she delayed stage 5. She asked more questions, allowed more discussion. She even began secretly training 2 new initiates, not to forget, but to resist. Their names were Nathaniel and Ruth. Nathaniel was a stonemason's son from Alabama, quiet and observant, with an uncanny ability to notice what wasn't being said. Ruth was a former teacher from Missouri, widowed young, who had a perfect memory, not just of her own life, but of others' dreams. Lydia tested them quietly over months, slipping references to Elijah, Michael, even the binder's mark into casual conversation. They remembered everything, and most importantly, they never looked away. Lydia told them nothing at first, only that they were special, only that a time would come when she would be gone, and someone would need to case. Read the second journal. They agreed. And then one day Nathaniel vanished. No ceremony, no retreat assignment, no letter, just gone. Ruth searched the grounds, questioned the watchers, prayed aloud in the chapel until her voice cracked. That night, the black journal turned a page on its own. In red it read, "Too many binders, reset required." And beneath that, Stage 7, Severance. Lydia had never heard of Stage 7, but she felt it, in the air, in her spine. The hollow was changing again. Lydia knew what severance meant. Not death, erasure, not of the body, but of every trace, every memory, every record. As if Nathaniel had never walked those halls, never eaten in silence, never whispered resistance into her ear beneath the orchard trees. She ran to the second journal, flipped to the page where she had written his name just weeks earlier. Gone, not crossed out, not smudged, erased. Even the ink had vanished, like it had never touched the page. The fibers were smooth, clean, too clean. She tried to rewrite his name. The pen would not mark the paper. Panic set in. She opened the ledger, the official Hollow Soul ledger, searched for Nathaniel's number, searched the daily work assignments, the dormitory list. Nothing. His bed was already reassigned. The watchers had done their work, and someone else had sanctioned it. The child. She had returned. No longer 12, now perhaps 17, taller, eyes sharper, no more riddles. She appeared at Lydia's chamber door that same evening, flanked by 2 watchers in jet-black robes. She didn't smile. She spoke one sentence. "You let memory spread." Lydia didn't respond. "You think the hollow was made by hands," the girl continued, "but it was grown in the soil of the forgetting, and you, Binder, are a weed." Lydia stood tall. "Then why keep me?" she asked. The girl tilted her head. "We don't need to destroy Yai." "No," she said, "we only need to split you." And with that the child turned, leaving the room as a chill swept over Lydia's skin. She dropped to her knees. She had read of this before, once in the first pages of the Black Journal back when Elijah still wrote. Split binders cannot be trusted. Their minds divide. Their truth bleeds. One self forgets, the other remembers, but neither knows which is real. Severance wasn't just erasure. It was division. If they couldn't remove Lydia entirely, they would break her into 2 selves, one loyal to the ritual, and one that would rot in a hidden cell, buried beneath layers of silence, knowing everything and unable to act. She had no time. Ruth was next, and if she didn't act now, the hollow would rewrite her too. She reached for the second journal and began the escape plan. The escape plan wasn't written in one sitting. It was woven, slowly, across weeks, masked within hymns, gardening assignments, and symbolic gestures that only Ruth could decipher. Lydia knew the hollow's eyes were everywhere now. The watchers, once silent, now hovered closer. The child walked the halls at dusk, no longer needing torches, her feet never making a sound. Even the trees had begun whispering, a low, rustling murmur that followed Lydia wherever she stepped. She moved carefully. In the second journal, she devised a map, not of the grounds, but of the false exits. Every trap door that led back to the choir, every false tunnel that circled into meditation chambers, every rope ladder that ended in brick walls or blinding salt smoke. The hollow had anticipated rebellion, but not from within the binder. Ruth was told to wait. Her signal would come as 3 dropped candles, each spaced 20 paces apart along the eastern path, a trick Lydia had read in Miriam's old entries, a remnant from an uprising centuries earlier when a binder nearly broke free before being drowned in honey and buried beneath the orchard. That same orchard now housed a cellar, sealed with runes no longer understood, only feared. Lydia had broken the lock weeks earlier using the original iron key, the same one that had first led her out with Michael. The cellar wasn't a hiding place. It was an exit node, not physical, psychological. A chamber designed to collapse the hollow's memory field long enough for one person to slip through the veil, if they moved fast enough. The risk? Lydia would have to stay inside the field to keep it open. She would anchor the exit, but at a cost. If Ruth failed, Lydia would forget herself entirely. Not death, fragmentation. She accepted that. Because Ruth remembered Michael's name. Because Ruth had begun hearing the song, the same low chant Michael had hummed beneath the monoliths before he vanished. Because Ruth had written her own journal without being told to. And because when Lydia looked into Ruth's eyes, she didn't see fear. She saw continuation. The ritual was ready. The candles would be dropped at dawn. And for the first time in 27 years, the hollow would breathe out. Dawn came without color. The sky above the house of stillness held no warmth, just a dull silver like metal cooling after the forge. The chapel bell did not ring that morning. The watchers were stationed oddly, not in their usual positions near the chapel doors or the perimeter trees, but gathered in a half-circle facing the orchard, as if they knew. But Lydia had planned for this. The candles had been dropped before dawn. 3 of them, 20 paces apart. Ruth had understood. She passed the watchers like a shadow, barefoot, wrapped in soil-stained robes, her breath slow, her eyes fixed downward. The watchers didn't move. Lydia watched from the bell tower, every muscle tense, her hands clutched around the second journal. The first candle. Ruth passed it. Nothing. The second. A slight gust of wind. The trees swayed unnaturally. Still nothing. The third candle was placed just feet from the orchard cellar door, the final threshold, a place where time no longer behaved, where shadows bent upward, and where the walls bled mist. Ruth reached the door. She hesitated only once. Then she opened it and stepped inside. Lydia ran. Down the bell tower, through the garden, past the silent rows of converts kneeling in morning prayer. None looked up, but one, a boy no older than 10, turned his head and stared directly into her soul. He did not blink. He whispered something. "She watches you now." Lydia didn't stop. She reached the orchard. The watchers turned as one. The child was among them, older still now, almost a woman, her robes pure white. "You have broken the sequence," she said softly. Lydia turned to her, breathless. "No," she replied. "I've completed it." Then she threw the second journal into the orchard fire. It ignited instantly, the flames burning blue, licking the air like it was starved of truth. The watchers screamed, not aloud, but from within, their bodies vibrating, unraveling at the edges. And in that moment, beneath the orchard floor, Ruth ran. Through the cellar, through the veil, through the memory field that Lydia held open with every last thought, every last name, every last piece of herself. Ruth passed through, and Lydia collapsed, eyes open, breathing shallow. But her mind, empty. The binder had fulfilled her final task. The veil sealed itself without sound. Above ground, the orchard returned to stillness. The candles dissolved. The blue flames faded to grey ash. The watchers stood motionless, flickering at the edges, like paper pressed too close to heat, outlines curling, identities fraying. And Lydia remained. Her body knelt in the orchard clearing, palms up, eyes open, staring into nothing. She didn't speak, didn't blink. Her chest rose and fell, but her breath was shallow, like someone waiting for instruction. She had entered severance by choice. The child approached slowly. She no longer wore white. Her robes were black now, not dyed but shadow-woven, shimmering with something older than cloth. Her face showed no triumph, no rage, only curiosity. She knelt beside Lydia and whispered, "You fractured yourself to let one soul out. What if she brings others?" Lydia didn't answer. Her mouth was open, slightly parted, but her tongue did not move. Still the child leaned closer. "What did you write in the fire?" she asked. "The journal burned, but the truth does not die. Where did you bury the root?" Silence. Then, a whisper. So faint, so broken. It barely shaped meaning. "She remembers." The child froze. Because that voice did not come from Lydia. It came from within the trees. Dozens of voices now, all whispering at once. Men, women, children, every soul whose name had been struck from the ledger, the forgotten, the silenced, the ones who had passed through stage 5 but never surrendered. Their memories were leaking back. Ruth hadn't just escaped. She'd become a breach. Miles away, across the state border, Ruth emerged barefoot on the steps of a small Baptist church outside Hazard, Kentucky. Her eyes were swollen, her fingers black with soot. Clutched in her arms was a new book. Not the second journal, not the black ledger, but something else, something alive. Its pages were blank, but warm. And on the cover, a single phrase etched by her own hand: "The Hollow remembers." As she walked toward the front doors, the church lights flickered, the pastor's wife fainted, and a nearby infant resting in a cradle began to hum the melody of a song never taught, a song the Hollow used to erase. But now it had returned, as a signal. Ruth looked up at the sky and smiled. The church in Hazard became ground zero. At first it seemed ordinary, a quiet building, weather-worn, tucked at the edge of a coal town that had long since stopped listening for miracles, but within days of Ruth's arrival, things began to shift. The congregation changed. People started remembering dreams they never had, of grey-robed children, humming fields, and hands reaching through orchard soil. A woman named Darla McKinney swore her grandfather, dead 40 years, had whispered a warning in her sleep. She broke the chain, but not the root. No one spoke Ruth's name aloud. They only referred to her as the girl who came with silence. She never told them where she'd been. She simply prayed, wrote, and listened. The book she carried remained unopened. But strange things began to happen. Children started singing in reverse. Wells ran cold in summer, and the trees around the church grew in perfect spirals. Something was growing again. Not the hollow as it once was, but its echo, its memory. Because what Lydia had done was far more than rebellion. She had infected the cycle with consciousness. For the first time in over 2 centuries, a binder had remembered herself and chosen not to continue the forgetting. And Ruth, she wasn't a convert. She was a carrier, On the night of the full moon, she opened the book for the first time. Inside was a single page, written not in her hand, but Lydia's. It read, "The veil is not the door, it's the mirror. You will see yourself as they saw you, and then you will know what they fear." She turned the page. Blank. Until the ink began to rise, not from pen but from memory. Names began to appear: Eleanor Bell, Thomas Whitman, Michael Dunbar, Nathaniel, Lydia Price, and then Ruth's, followed by the phrase, "Stage 8, return." She blinked. There had never been a stage 8. Not in any ledger, not in Elijah's writings, not in the choir. This was something new, something unpredicted. She turned the page again. The ink wrote itself slowly, like blood seeping through gauze. "The hollow has fed on forgetting. Now it will starve. Because I remember you." From miles away, beneath the ore, charred Lydia's eyes snapped open, and she spoke the name, Ruth. The whisper of her name didn't echo, it etched. It carved itself into the chapel floor of the House of Stillness, winding like a crack through the stone. The watchers paused mid-step, every candle in the hall of shedding extinguished. The flame in the altar dropped cold, and the vines, the hollow's ancient underground crop, began to recoil. Because the hollow understood what was happening. Ruth wasn't just a breach anymore. She had become a mirror. And the hollow had never seen its own reflection before. Lydia, still kneeling beneath the orchard, blinked for the first time in weeks. Her lips cracked, her hands twitched, and slowly memory returned. Not just as thought, but as form. Faces, rituals, screams, laughter. Michael's eyes, her mother's hands, the way the ledger pages resisted red ink, the way Elijah smelled of salt and vinegar when he lied. She stood. Somewhere far beneath her, the hollow trembled. Back in Hazard, Ruth began gathering. Not an army, not a cult, just witnesses. Those who had dreamed, those who had been marked. A man who woke with vines wrapped around his wrist, a woman who found her daughter humming in her sleep, words in a language she swore she'd never spoken, a child who drew the eye without ever having seen it. They came, quietly, not to fight, but to remember. Because Ruth had begun teaching them the counter-ritual, the one Lydia had buried in her second journal, the ritual of preservation through witness. A right not to forget, but to anchor. For every name remembered aloud, the hollow would lose a root. For every story retold, a watcher would unravel, and for every convert who resisted stage 5, the veil would thin. Ruth opened the book each night. More names appeared. Some came from dreams, others from strangers who remembered faces they never knew. One night, a man brought a name carved into his skin. Another brought a tooth. All brought memory. And on the 7th night, the child appeared. Older now, fully grown, she stood at the church steps, no longer wearing robes. She wore Ruth's face. She didn't knock. She just spoke, loud enough for every soul inside to hear. You are not the binder. You are the flame she hid in the roots. Ruth looked out the window and smiled. Then you already know what fire does to hollow things. The standoff began in silence. The woman outside the church, wearing Ruth's face, didn't move, didn't blink. She was too perfect, no breath, no weight, a shell crafted from memory, a last weapon drawn by the hollow, not to kill, but to confuse. Inside, the congregation waited. Ruth closed the book gently and handed it to Darla McKinney, the first to witness. "If I don't return," she whispered, "keep reading it aloud." Darla nodded, already weeping. Ruth stepped out onto the steps. The imitation smiled. Why resist? It asked. You were already chosen. Lydia named you before the fire. You carry her burden. Ruth stepped closer. No, she said. I carry her choice. There's a difference. The imitation tilted its head. The voice changed, first to Lydia's, then to Michael's, then to Elijah's. They all broke, it said. You will too. Ruth reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small shard of obsidian, taken from the altar beneath the hollow during her escape. When she held it in the light, it reflected not her face but the orchard, still burning. Do you know what happens when the names return? She asked. The soil cracks, the choir forgets, and the ledger loses count. The hollow didn't reply. Instead, the woman's face began to melt, not with fire but with memory. Wrinkles formed, scars emerged, her hands trembled, her eyes flickered between identities. Too many names, too many selves. The hollow was trying to wear them all at once. But Ruth spoke over it, one name at a time. Nathaniel. The wind shifted. Lydia. The clouds above churned. Cale Dunbar. The grass withered beneath their feet. Thomas Whitman. The imitation dropped to one knee. Eleanor Bell. It screamed, a sound like stone grinding on bone collapsing inward. And then, finally, Ruth whispered. Ruth. Not her name. The original Ruth. The teacher, the widow, the memory, the one the hollow tried to use, the one it could never fully erase. At that name, the woman shattered, not like glass, but like a lie forgotten mid-sentence. Her limbs folded in, her robes turned to ash, and where she stood was only soil, scorched, steaming, alive. Ruth looked to the hills beyond. The fog had lifted. She turned back toward the door and whispered into the wind. One root burned. 31 more to go. And behind her in the chapel, the book began to write again. The book wrote on its own now. No pen, no ink, just lines of memory pressing themselves into the pages like scar tissue. The witnesses inside the church gathered around it in reverence and fear. Each word pulsed faintly, as if the book was breathing. Darla McKinney stepped forward to read aloud, as Ruth had instructed. The next name appeared, Sarah Price. A murmur swept the room. The name had never been spoken, not even by Lydia. It had always been hidden behind Elijah, behind the doctrine, behind the choir. But Sarah was the first binder, the one who planted the seed, the one who whispered the original forgetting into the soil. And now, she was awake. Miles away, beneath what remained of the house of stillness, stone cracked. Roots once thought long dead, smooth, grey, vein-thick ropes, twisted beneath the orchard. One reached the altar, another snaked into the hollow choir's deepest cell, coiling around a sealed iron box that had not been opened since 1807. Inside it, the original ledger, the one before the Price family rewrote Doctrine, before Elijah. It bore Sarah's handwriting, and one sentence repeated over and over in blood. It must forget to live. It must forget to live. It must forget to live. Back in Hazard, the church lights flickered. Ruth staggered as she re-entered. Her skin was pale, eyes glassy, hands trembling, but she smiled. She knows, she whispered. The old one. She's watching. The congregation didn't speak. They felt it too. A shift in the room. A pressure. Like the hollow had realized what Ruth truly was. Not a binder. A counter-ritual. A living rejection. And now the hollow, for the first time in its history, had no active binder. Lydia had severed herself. Ruth had refused. The chain had snapped. And without that central mind, without one soul willing to forget so others could vanish, the system began to decay. All across the countryside, other sights flickered, not with light, but with absence. In West Virginia, a former Quaker community collapsed in on itself in a single night. In rural Pennsylvania, a chapel burned with no visible fire, leaving only black ash and humming stone. And in Missouri, a retired priest dug up his orchard and found a staircase leading nowhere, carved with names he'd never heard, but couldn't stop repeating. The hollow was unraveling. But it wasn't dying. It was remembering itself. And in doing so, it began to wake. The hollow had never been alive. Not in the way people understood life. Not cells and breath and pulse, but in a deeper, older sense. It was a structure of memory, a cathedral of forgetting, built from the obedience of thousands who surrendered their pasts for the illusion of peace. But when Ruth shattered the chain, when Lydia broke the ledger, something inside the hollow shifted from pattern to will. It had no binder. So it began to bind itself. In a rotting corner of the old Calvin's hollow orchard, soil cracked open. The ground gave way not to roots, but to bones. Thousands of them, perfectly arranged, stacked in spirals, engraved with names long lost. And at the center of this ossuary was a heart, not flesh, but stone, pulsing fain, glowing red beneath layers of vine ash and dirt. The heart of the hollow. Every time Ruth spoke a name aloud, the stone pulsed. It didn't weaken, it learned, because forgetting had once been its defense. But now, in memory, it found form. It began reassembling lost watchers from dust and shadow, but they no longer followed. They searched. For Ruth, for Lydia, for any part of itself that had escaped. In Hazard, the congregation began hearing noises under the floorboards, rhythmic, wet, like something was breathing up from the church's foundation. Ruth ordered the floorboards pulled up. Beneath them, salt, black salt, packed tightly in a spiral formation. An ancient seal used in counter-rituals, not placed by her, not by Lydia. It had been there long before the church existed, buried by someone else. A forgotten predecessor, a war before the hollow. Ruth began to understand. She hadn't broken the cycle. She'd triggered the next phase. And the book, still writing, began cataloguing new names. Names of people not yet gone, people being chosen. A librarian in Georgia, a deaf child in Nova Scotia, a convict in Kansas who carved a tree into his cell wall the night before his execution. The hollow wasn't dying, it was gathering, forming itself not in land but in people. The rituals would no longer need stone halls or orchards. They would be held in minds, in habits, in unspoken beliefs, in collective amnesia. And Ruth, she would become something the hollow feared most, an archive, a living memory it could not erase. But even archives can be breached, and somewhere beneath a burned-down seminary in Missouri, a girl named Anna began writing in her sleep. She wrote one phrase over and over in a hand not her own. Stage 9, integration. Anna was only 10. Her parents thought it was stress. The fire at the old seminary had displaced dozens of families in their Miss Surreytown. But Anna hadn't cried, hadn't screamed. She'd simply started writing, each night in perfect cursive, with a pen that never ran dry, on paper no one gave her. And the words weren't hers. They were old. Too old. Her mother found her at 3:17 a.m., kneeling by the window, eyes closed, whispering names in a language she swore the child had never heard. On the floor, in a perfect spiral, dozens of pages, each bearing the same phrase in different hands. Stage 9, integration. The hollow had reached her, but it wasn't possession. It was residency. Because with no binder left in the field, the hollow had changed form again. It no longer sought obedience through ritual. It now sought presence through hosts, and the young were the most susceptible, blank pages waiting to be written upon. Back in Hazard, Ruth felt it. She awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, with pages from the book fluttering around her as if caught in an unseen wind. Names written that she hadn't spoken, places she'd never been, symbols from languages she didn't know. And one sentence, written in bold red ink across the last clean page. Anna carries the choir. Her stomach turned. The choir, once a physical place beneath Calvin's Hollow, had never been destroyed. Lydia had sealed it, yes, but it had learned from the silence. Now it had found a new sanctuary, not under a chapel, inside a child. Ruth knew the signs. Her veins had begun to darken, her fingertips numb. The closer she came to remembering the full structure, the more the hollow pressed back, like memory had become radioactive. She gathered the last 7 witnesses. They formed a circle. Each was given a name from the old ledger, not as an identity, but as a firewall. To speak a forgotten name aloud, to bind it to your breath, was to deny the hollow the right to rewrite it. But the hollow had a new weapon now: familiarity. The witnesses began dreaming of their childhood homes, their lost loved ones, their greatest regrets, twisted into ritual scripts, whispered by people they trusted. The hollow wasn't erasing them. It was folding into them. One witness, a man named Owen, tore out his tongue during sleep. Another, a woman named June, spoke for 13 hours straight in a dead dialect until her throat collapsed. And Anna? She began drawing new maps. Maps of places no one had ever built, but that everyone recognized. Because the hollow was done hiding, it was becoming human. By now, the book had stopped writing. Not because it was full, it still had hundreds of empty pages, but because it no longer needed to. The hollow had moved beyond pages. It had begun writing directly into people. Ruth could see it in the witnesses' eyes. They were fraying, not from fear, but from contradiction, remembering things that hadn't happened, reciting rituals they'd never been taught, and worst of all, forgetting the truths they had vowed to carry. The firewall of names was weakening. Each day more of the ledger bled red, not written but bleeding, as if the names themselves were in pain. Sarah Price, Eleanor Bell, Nathaniel, even Lydia's began to distort, the letters stretching and curling into symbols. And Ruth? She began dreaming in third person. She saw herself walking the orchard at dusk, speaking the ritual aloud, comforting converts, burning journals. But it wasn't her. It was another Ruth. An integration. Because stage 9 wasn't possession or memory. It was synthesis. The hollow had decided that resistance was inefficient. Forgetting had flaws. Binding had risks. But if it could become the memory, if it could wear the faces of its enemies, speak in the tongues of witnesses, recall the betrayals as if it had lived them, then it could survive anything. Ruth stood before the mirror in the church hall. Her reflection blinked half a second late. Her mouth stayed closed, but she heard herself whisper, "We never wanted worship. We only wanted permanence. And now will he have you?" She stepped back. The mirror cracked. Lines formed across her face like hairline fractures beneath the skin. Not wounds, but edits. She was being rewritten. And somewhere far away in the hills of Missouri, Anna finished the final map. It depicted a city made entirely of memory, floating above land, rooted in silence. At the center, a spire, and in its highest chamber, a chair, empty, waiting, not for a priest, not for a binder, for the first integrated soul, the one who remembered everything, the one who forgot nothing, the one who had willingly become the hollow. Ruth closed her eyes and saw herself in the chair, but she wasn't afraid. She was smiling, because even now, deep within the convergence, one word echoed, not erased, not corrupted. spoken by the only voice the hollow couldn't silence. Lydia. And the word was separate. Lydia's word was separate, hit like a hammer across time. Not shouted, not screamed, whispered. But whispered from within the hollow. From a place it had buried so deep, even it had forgotten. Somewhere beneath the choir, beneath the names, beneath the rituals, was a seed, not planted by Elijah, not even by Sarah Price, but by the first anomaly, the one who resisted the original forgetting. Lydia had never destroyed the hollow. She had split it. A fracture woven into its root system, dormant, waiting for a future soul to reach deep enough to awaken it. And that soul was Ruth. When Lydia whispered, "Separate," Ruth felt it in her spine. Her bones rattled, her breath stopped. The room around her collapsed in light. The witnesses dropped to the floor, convulsing. The book screamed, not aloud but inside, every page vibrating with the force of unspoken truth. Ruth staggered, eyes wide, staring at her own trembling hands. They weren't just hers anymore. She was both, the Ruth who fled the hollow, and the Ruth who had never left. The hollow had integrated her, but she had counter-integrated it. Inside her mind now stood two altars, one of forgetting, one of remembrance, and between them a chair, the same chair Anna had drawn, the one that ruled the city of memory. But Ruth saw something Anna hadn't. The chair wasn't meant to be occupied. It was meant to be denied. Because whoever sat in that chair became the voice of the hollow, and that voice would not speak commands. It would write them. Into memory, into people, into every whispered doubt and surrendered truth. Ruth knew what had to happen. She had to walk into the city, into the spire, into the room, and destroy the chair. But it wouldn't be easy. She'd need help. She turned to the witnesses, barely conscious, shaking. She laid her hand on Darla's chest, whispered Lydia's name, and watched the woman breathe deeply. A name could still anchor a soul. She spoke another. Michael. Another breath stabilized. She moved from one to the next, speaking names like sacred keys, unlocking them from the hollow's grasp. It worked. But time was collapsing. The hollow had sensed the split. It was tightening, condensing, preparing the city. It knew Ruth was coming, and this time, it would be ready. The hollow city rose without a sound. Not from the ground, but from memory itself, carved into the minds of those who had once touched its rituals, whispered its mantras, tasted its ash. A place not built, but recalled, constructed entirely from remembered architecture and forgotten obedience. Spire by spire, it grew. Witnesses across states collapsed in unison, eyes wide, mouths open, whispering the names of streets they'd never walked and hymns they'd never been taught. And at the center, it waited. The chair of convergence. Forged from the bones of every binder, every erased convert, every soul who had passed through stage 5 and never returned. It wasn't symbolic. It was alive, breathing in secrets, exhaling doctrine. Ruth stood at the edge of the city, the book clutched in one hand, a lantern in the other. The sky above her was neither day nor night, a swirling canvas of colorless cloud, trembling under the weight of unexpressed thought. She had crossed over. Not physically, but through memory possession. A path Lydia had carved in the final moments of her resistance. A tether from the witness to the city. Each step forward sharpened the world around her. Cobblestones formed underfoot, inscribed with names, the ones the hollow had forgotten to forget. Buildings shaped from layered whispers, doorways made from bent doctrine and song. Every window she passed showed herself in different versions, as a child, as a convert, as a watcher, and finally, as the binder. The city wasn't trying to scare her. It was trying to seduce her. to make her believe that this place was the conclusion of memory, that integration was peace, that resistance was noise in a perfect hymn. But Ruth spoke aloud even as she walked. Michael Dunbar, Sarah Price, Thomas Whitman, Nathaniel, Lydia. Each name a torchlight, each syllable weakening the fabric of the city around her. The watchers began to form, emerging not from walls but from the space between steps, flickering, multiplying, but not attacking, just watching, waiting to see if she would choose the chair, if she would sit, because that was the true trap. The hollow didn't take its voice by force. It waited for someone to offer it, to believe the chair was salvation, that the silence was safety, that remembering had become too painful to carry. And as Ruth climbed the final steps to the spire, she wondered if they were right. Because her own memories were fracturing now, time looping, faces blending. And the chair, it was warm, as if it had been waiting only for her. Ruth stood before the chair of convergence. It was not grand, not golden, nor towering. It was carved from bonewood, pale, smooth, polished by centuries of obedience. The arms bore faint fingerprints. The seat was indented, not by weight but by submission. Its back curved slightly just on or to cradle the shoulders of anyone too tired to resist, and it was perfectly her size. The room was silent, not empty, just full of expectation. Around her, the walls of the spire whispered, not in words but in breaths, in long exhalations of every soul the hollow had ever bound. Their memory formed the architecture, their regret, the mortar, and their silence. That was the price of its survival. The watchers appeared, not outside this time, but within the walls, their bodies sewn into the stone, their mouths now open, no longer stitched, gasping like fish in airless water. Some bore her face, others Lydia's. One looked exactly like Michael. They didn't move. They didn't plead. They remembered. And the hollow fed on that remembrance, growing tighter, brighter, more seductive with each pulse. Ruth took a step forward, and then another. Her hand reached toward the chair's arm. Her fingertips touched its edge. It was warm, familiar, like a promise. "It's easier," the hollow said. Its voice came from nowhere, and everywhere, to guide from within, to carry them gently. No more conflict, no more pain, only integration. Ruth's knees buckled. The memories were screaming now, not in pain but urgency, not telling her to run, but warning her to choose. Because the hollow wasn't wrong, the burden was heavy. The witnesses were fracturing. The world was forgetting itself, and she, a single name, a single spine, had carried it long enough. Her fingers curled around the chair's armrest. She lowered herself slowly. But before she could sit, the book, which had lain dormant in her coat, exploded open. Pages torn from spine, ink boiling into the air. And one voice, sharp, maternal, infinite, roared through the room. "You are not the final memory." It was Lydia. Not as a ghost, as a break. A rupture in the hollow's ritual. Her mind reasserting itself through Ruth, through the book, through the very memory the hollow had failed to contain. Ruth's eyes snapped open. She saw the chair for what it was, a tomb.